What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we need to talk about Jane Foster Thor. Specifically, we need to talk about what they're going to do with her. Contrary to what you guys may believe, I am not one of those weird people out there who hated Jane Foster. I guess maybe weird is not the best description there. There were people who didn't really like Jane Foster for legitimate reasons, because they didn't really like the way the stories were written, which is fair. Well, I don't expect everybody to love every single story that was written out there. When I talk about the weirdos, I'm talking about like the ones who are like a woman in a prominent position in comics? That's a problem, because the girl in my science class doesn't like me, even though I like her. And so all girls are bad. You know, like that weirdo group out there, right? Like that weirdo crowd, right? There's people who are like, I don't like it when things change in comics, even though comics are literally a walking, talking definition of change. Like, I don't like it when things are different. Like, I'm talking about that crowd out there, right? Those guys out there. I loved Jane Foster Thor. I loved the way the stories were written. It was just great to see somebody else play the role of Thor besides Odin's son. I absolutely love that, because I've been reading comics for years and years and years and years, and it was cool to just see something different, right? It was cool to just see things shifted up. In the end, it was going to go back to Odin's son. Anybody who's read comics for any measure of time knew that Thor, Odin's son, was going to get his hammer back. And if you didn't believe that, well, I would understand if you said you were new to comics. If you told me you've been reading comics for years and you were pissed off about that, I'd be like, well, unless you're mad about the stories not being written that well, then you have no reason to be mad, because literally Odin's son is going to go back to being Thor. So stop pretending the world's ending, read the comics, enjoy the ride, like have a Coke and a smile, like that kind of thing, you know? So it's like, just chill. But for those of you guys who were unfamiliar with that, unfamiliar with the whole Jane Foster Thor thing, in the comics, the way it played out is it was really just the result of Gore the God Butcher and all the things that it led up to that. That in the Original Sin storyline, which was really more of like an informational storyline, instead of it being something like Original Sin, where it was just like a big event unfolding, the purpose of Original Sin, while it did have its own core story, which was largely pointless, the purpose of it was to basically have this moment when the eyes of the Watcher, after the Watcher were killed, were basically blasted to the world, and everybody learned everybody's secrets, right? They learned all these aspects of themselves that had basically been hidden away. So like Captain America, for example, learned that he was at one point part of the Illuminati, but because he didn't want to destroy worlds during the incursions, his mind was wiped by Stephen Strange at the request of Iron Man, and he was thrown out of the Illuminati team, right? Totally made to forget everything that had happened. So that whole bit of manipulation that right there pissed off Captain America to no end. The guy then with Captain America, he lost his super soldier serum in the Nail storyline. He aged up. So by the time the 8 months later time skip happens during Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers going into Secret Wars, he's just this crotchety old son of a bitch who's like hunting down the Illuminati with the full might of S.H.I.E.L.D. It's amazing. It's just this ridiculously amazing story. But, you know, that's basically the gist of Original Sin. But the idea here is that Thor lost his ability to lift his hammer because of the aftermath of Gore the God Butcher, in the sense that Nick Fury told him that Gore was right, and the gods really are not worthy in any real way. And so with Thor seemingly believing that, he couldn't lift his hammer anymore. This really gave us a situation where like someone mysterious picked up the hammer of Thor instead. And we didn't know who it was. Right, when that whole story arc first picked up, a lot of people out there were saying like, it's Jane Foster. It's the most likely person to pick up the hammer. She's the one that's had the most involvement in Thor's life, insofar as the person who's always kind of been in his corner, their historical relationship when he was Donald Blake and the romance that took place there, things like that. People were like, for a variety of reasons, Jane Foster's the most likely person. But there are a lot of other theories out there too, like it's Captain America or some other member of the Avengers that you would never expect to be worthy of lifting Thor's hammer, Loki or somebody along those lines, you know, in the supervillain community. Of course, it turned out to be Jane Foster. And then she became the mighty Thor. And so what you had was basically her and her storyline dealing with like the Asgardians who are like, you're not Thor, right? You are not him, and we will not give you the worthiness and respect that we would give to Odin's son. So basically the Asgardians that were kind of being playing the role of like the real world folks who were just hating on Jane, right? You know, that kind of a thing. But I love the stories. Absolutely adored the stories of Jane Foster. And to this day, I still say it's one of the best Thor storylines ever written in Marvel Comics. I absolutely love it. Having said that, one of the things to know is that during that storyline, right, during the time when you had Jane Foster Thor, Odin's son couldn't lift his own hammer. And so you only had one Mjolnir running around there. And we all knew, at least those of us who read comics or who had been reading comics for any real measure of time, we all knew that Odin's son was going to get his hammer back. It's a rule of comics, right? It's a rule of the way that Marvel writes things, and even DC to a degree, that you have this status quo. And things may deviate away from the status quo, but it never stays that way for an exceedingly long amount of time, right? Sometimes it does. It depends on just the direction that Marvel wants to go. Like they brought back Bucky Barnes, for example. He's been back ever since, but he was dead for something like 30 years. No, it was longer than that. He vanished in the old school Captain America comics by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. Marvel brought back Captain America in the 60s with Avengers number 4. Bucky Barnes didn't show up until the 2000s during Ed Brubaker's run. So you're talking about arguably 60 to 70 years that Bucky Barnes was gone. And then they brought him back, right? So, I mean, that's fine. But like Uncle Ben from Spider-Man has been dead just for decades, and he'll stay dead for decades. Alternate reality versions of him may come back, but he'll stay dead for decades. So by and large, with the exception of a handful of different things, everything goes back to the status quo. When Captain America's history was altered in Secret Empire, and basically he was changed so that he had always been a Hydra agent, he literally conquered North America with his sights set on the world. He ended up going back to being or at least you ended up getting good Captain America back, and that was it, right? Like it went back to being just the regular Captain America as we know him. Everything goes back to normal. There's no reason to believe that wouldn't be the case in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because you never really see an example where you have two different versions of the same character running around. Take, for example, like Natasha Romanoff, right? She was Black Widow, and so now her sister, Yelena, is basically going to become probably the new Black Widow in some form or fashion. Likely she'll be thrown in the Thunderbolts. She'll end up finding out that essentially she was lied to by Contessa about the whole thing with Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye and all that kind of stuff, and that her sister died for a worthy cause, and then she's going to defect against the Thunderbolts, and she's going to end up joining the new Avengers. That's most likely what's going to happen with her character. You look at somebody like Loki, for example, right? Like, sure, in the Loki TV show, you had different varying versions of Loki, but they were different versions of himself from alternate realities, and their introduction in the show did nothing more than serve the purpose of showing the different versions of Loki that you have across the multiverse. But it's not like that show came to an end, and Loki returned back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and, his death in Avengers Endgame or Infinity War was somehow averted, and you had Loki and Sylvie running around in the universe. That didn't happen. That's not something that you would expect to see. And so there's no reason to believe that you would see both Natalie Portman Thor and Chris Hemsworth Thor in the Marvel Cinematic Universe together. That most likely, one of them's gotta go. Which one it's gonna be, I'm not entirely sure. Because what you have in this movie and everything that we've been told is that Jane Foster's dealing with a quote-unquote dark secret. That's probably the cancer storyline. That Jane Foster had cancer and she was dying while she was Thor. Like literally when she changed back into her human form, her cancer would just start ravaging her body. When she changed into Thor, it would hold her cancer off, but it didn't cure her cancer. It wasn't until later on that her cancer was basically cured. But at that point in time, like she was dying as she was Thor. And so it was kind of a crazy thing. Like that most likely is what's going on here in terms of that whole situation. But even then, is Natalie Portman going to stay Thor, or is she going to die at the end of the movie because of her cancer or something along those lines? Or is she going to die in battle, kind of go out in a blaze of glory, right? Is that how her character is going to unfold? With Chris Hemsworth, there's questions there too, right? He's the last, really one of the last of the Avengers. That is Chris Hemsworth and Mark Ruffalo and Jeremy Renner. They're basically the last ones. And that's essentially it. Supposedly, we're going to have Hulkling, I think it is, and She-Hulk. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were like, Hulkling's basically the new Hulk-esque character. Or maybe it'll be She-Hulk. I have no idea. But whatever the case is, I would say in the next 5 years, those three will be gone. They'll be done and out of the picture, right? Just written out and killed off, retired, whatever. But they'll end up going the way of either Captain America or Iron Man, right? Dead or retired. And that's basically going to be it. So that kind of leaves the landscape open for what are, in effect, their replacements. And that begs the question, is Jane Foster going to continue on? Is her cancer going to be cured somehow? And she basically ends up going, becoming the new Thor because Chris Hemsworth dies at the end of Thor 4. No clue. And that really, while that is interesting insofar as that's the thing that a lot of people want to know, the movie needs to end with a finite explanation in that way. That it can't be some open-ended, ambiguous ending where it's like, well, maybe Thor will continue on. It's Chris Hemsworth. I mean, we don't really know. And the movie just kind of, sits there and you've got Chris Hemsworth and you've got Natalie Portman standing on the top of a mountain and it's like, well, what happens next? And like the sun's setting and they look at each other and they're like, who knows where our next adventures will take us, and like roll credits, right? You can't have that. It has to be one or the other. I mean, I guess maybe you could do two Thors And it's kind of difficult to do that, but there's limitations to that, right? Like, even in Marvel Comics, you've technically got two Spider-Men running around at the same time. It's Miles and it's Peter Parker. So it's not to say it's impossible. It's just very, very, very difficult to pull off and to make work, because by and large, the casual movie-going audience wants one or the other. They don't necessarily want both. I think it'd be cool to have both, but where do you fit them, right? Where do you put them? You know, is the new Avengers kind of like Avengers step down, right? Does she get shuffled off to like the West Coast Avengers and that's where she serves? And Chris Hemsworth stays on the main Avengers team, which is actually not a bad idea, to be honest with you, now that I think about it. That's a good idea. Just form the West Coast Avengers and just take like the secondaries and just shuffle them off to the West Coast Avengers. There you go. MCU. Genius idea. I don't know if they're going to do that or not, but that's kind of my big concern here going into seeing this movie. It's not gore. I love the way gore looks. I don't really care about anything else. My question is, what are they going to do with like Chris Hemsworth Thor, Jane Foster Thor, right? Is he going to die? Is she going to die? How's that going to work? So with that being said, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section, right? Do you think Chris Hemsworth will live, or do you think Natalie Portman will live, right? Which Thor do you think will be the one they use going forward? Let me know what you guys think. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.